Welcome to World History in the West. The topic for this week is World War II. As we progress through the material, please keep in mind the following central question. Did World War II represent the preservation of Western democracy or the emergence of a new world order? Introduction. Following the Great War, there was hope for peace within Europe and the world. It was hoped that the creation of the League of Nations following World War I would help to foster lasting peace. However, the peace that was established was soon challenged by emerging dictatorships in Germany, Italy, Spain, and Russia. Hitler's ascension to power, along with that of Benito Mussolini in Italy, would pave the road to an even greater conflict. World War II would claim the lives of over 60 million people and shake the foundations of the world and threaten the future of the West. Lecture context. Where? Europe and the world. When? September 3, 1939 to September 2, 1945. Lecture topics. Hitler's rise to power, early developments in the war drags on, and the end draws near. The central question of the week. Did World War II represent the preservation of Western democracy or the emergence of a new world order? The broader picture. World War II was preceded by the growth of fascism and communism during the interwar period. In addition, the foundations for war were laid well in advance by the failures of the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. This time period falls within the modern era. Hitler's rise to power. Throughout history, there have been many terrible dictators. One of the worst was Adolf Hitler. But how did someone so horrible gain power? After his failed government coup in 1923, known as the Beer Hall Putsch, Hitler recognized he would have to gain power through the manipulation of Germany's democratic system. Starting in 1923, Hitler was named Chancellor. The Reichstag fire then occurred, allowing him to enact the Enabling Act, which gave emergency powers to restrict freedoms and abolish other political parties. He then orchestrated the Night of Long Knives, where he eliminated his opposition, most notably Ernst Röhm and the SA. The death of the aging president Hindenburg allowed Hitler to combine the roles of Chancellor and President, thus becoming full dictator by 1934. Hitler's system of government. Hitler became a totalitarian leader. A totalitarian leader uses the military and secret police to control society. The German secret police was known as the Gestapo, and Hitler's most dedicated military force was the SS. A totalitarian leader also uses fear as a primary motivator and controls the flow of information. Hitler appointed German Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels to control the information that Germans received. In addition, a totalitarian society is remade around a specific ideology. Hitler remade Germany around the ideology of fascism. Hitler's ideology. Hitler remade Germany around the ideology of fascism. This is extreme nationalism where a nation is willing to eliminate other ethnic groups in an attempt to assert their dominance. Hitler viewed Aryans as pure Germans and all other ethnicities as inferior, most notably the Jews. However, he also sought to eliminate the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe and those with physical or mental challenges. Each year, a Nazi rally was held in the city of Nuremberg. The famous and now banned film Triumph of the Will chronicled one of these rallies. Appeasement fails. The Great Depression and memories of the horrors of trench warfare from World War I were still fresh in the minds of the Allies. They did not want war with Germany again. The Allies pursued a policy of appeasement in the hopes of avoiding war. In the end, this policy was a complete failure and would force the resignation of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. The policy of appeasement had allowed Germany to rearm, reoccupy the Rhineland, unify with Austria-Hungary, acquire part of Czechoslovakia and then all of Czechoslovakia through the Munich Agreement, develop an alliance with Italy, and a non-aggression pact with Russia. The final straw was the invasion of Poland, which finally resulted in action by the French and British. The early phases of the war. On September 1, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. 2 days later, the French and British declared war on Germany. The winter of 1939-1940 would become known as the Phony War, as no battles took place. However, Hitler was not done, and began to invade neighboring countries in the spring of 1940, using a new military tactic called blitzkrieg. Allied forces would be forced back and eventually evacuated during the Miracle of Dunkirk. Hitler would take all of France by June 22, 1940. The occupation of France. The Maginot Line was a system of fortifications along the French-German border developed by France during the interwar period. Ultimately, the Maginot Line failed to prevent the German invasion, and after 6 weeks of fighting, France surrendered on June 22, 1940. The northern portion of France was occupied, while the southern portion remained independent technically, and was renamed Vichy France. This was essentially a German puppet government under former French General Marshal Pétain. The end of the beginning. The Phony War was indeed over as Hitler invaded much of Western Europe in the spring of 1940 using his new military tactic Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war. He would soon set his sights on new objectives, namely Britain, Russia, and North Africa, each of which would become his greatest failures. For those living under German occupation, life would drastically change and liberation would take many years. The Battle of Britain. After conquering France and the rest of Western Europe during the spring of 1940, Hitler's next objective was Britain during the summer of 1940. He intended to first bomb Britain and then launch a land invasion called Operation Sea Lion. German heavy bombers targeted major English cities during the Blitz. The development of radar stations alerted the British to these incoming attacks. The heroics of the RAF, the Royal Air Force, and the leadership of Winston Churchill eventually caused Hitler to change his focus to invading Russia. Nazi occupation of Europe. Evaluate the map closely. What would motivate Finland to cooperate with the Nazis? And why was Sweden not occupied? Mid-war events. From 1941 to 1943, the following events occurred. The Germans invaded deep into Russia, culminating in the Siege of Stalingrad. Senior Nazi General Erwin Rommel led the German invasion of North Africa. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese completed a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, bringing the Americans into the war. American and British troops would then push German forces out of North Africa and begin the liberation of Italy. By this time, Japan controlled much of the Pacific Islands. Allied bombing raids would increase in both Europe and Asia. Operation Barbarossa. Following the unsuccessful Battle of Britain, Hitler set his sights on invading Russia. Prior to the war, Hitler and Stalin had agreed to a non-aggression pact. Hitler's troops invaded Russia in 1941, thereby violating the agreement. Stalin was enraged at this betrayal. The German army made huge advances into Russia, reaching the outskirts of Moscow and occupying Stalingrad. Hitler believed his mechanized army could withstand the Russian winter and avoid the failures Napoleon's forces had experienced well over a century ago. Operation Barbarossa. The invasion of Russia is considered one of Hitler's greatest errors, as it diverted troops from other regions and decimated morale. As the Russian winter set in, the Russian army mobilized and thousands of Germans froze to death. German reinforcements would arrive the following summer, but by then the Russian army had been strengthened and began to push the Germans back. Stalingrad would become the bloodiest battle in human history, claiming over 2 million lives. The war in North Africa. In 1940, Italy invaded Egypt to control the Suez Canal, a key transportation hub. They experienced little success, and by 1942 Hitler sent German troops to Egypt and much of North Africa. British forces led by General Bernard Montgomery and American forces led by General George Patton eventually pushed German troops out of North Africa. The Allies would next focus on liberating Italy. The soft underbelly of Europe. In July of 1943, the Americans, British, and Canadians invaded the Italian island of Sicily. From there, they invaded the boot of Italy. Mussolini was overthrown by Italians and reinstalled as the leader in northern Italy by Hitler. Germany then occupied Italy and slowed Allied advances. Allied forces eventually prevailed, breaching the Gustav Line and liberating Rome. Mussolini was captured and executed by Italians themselves. The defeat of the Axis in Europe. The following events occurred from 1944 to 1945. The Normandy invasion of France by Allied forces would take place on June 6, 1944, known as D-Day. This foothold in Europe allowed the Allies to slowly push back German forces from the west. In the east, the Soviets were advancing on Germany following the Battle of Stalingrad. Hitler would commit suicide on April 30, 1945, as Russian troops encircled Berlin. VE Day, Victory in Europe, would take place on May 7, 1945. The Foothold, D-Day. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, France. British forces were assigned Gold and Sword beaches, Canada, Juno Beach, and the US, Utah, and Omaha beaches. The Allies gained a foothold on continental Europe, and within the next year would slowly push the Nazi forces back. This was the largest sea-to-land invasion in human history, and was vital to the eventual defeat of the Nazis. The Normandy invasion. Take a moment and try to remember the code names for the 5 sections of the Normandy beaches. In addition, who is the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe? Allies push back Germans. Allied ground forces advanced on the Germans from the west, following D-Day. Soviet forces advanced from the east following the siege of Stalingrad. Frequent bombing raids, some including as many as 500 to 1,000 Allied aircraft, destroyed major cities in Germany like Munich and Berlin. In the west, the Germans made a last attempt to push the Allied forces back. This became known as the Battle of the Bulge, in which the Germans encircled American troops. General George Patton would come to the aid of the US troops, and the retreat of the Nazi forces would continue. The death of Hitler. Surrounded by Soviet troops, Hitler and his new wife, Eva Braun, moved to a bunker below the Chancellor's residence in Berlin, where he and Braun committed suicide on April 30, 1945. Hitler had first poisoned himself, then shot himself. His body was immediately burned by his guards. He did not want to be put on trial in front of the world, nor have his body paraded around as a war trophy. VE Day, Victory in Europe. The Allies had slowly pushed the Germans back over 11 months of intense fighting following D-Day. Russian forces liberated Berlin and then met the advancing American forces at the Elbe River. On May 7, 1945, Germany unconditionally surrendered. The war in Europe was finally over. However, the war in the Pacific would continue. The defeat of the Axis powers in the Pacific. Here is a brief overview of the war in the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched their sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, thus bringing the United States into the war. After focusing first on liberating Europe, American forces then started the challenging task of liberating Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. Once within range of Japan, bombing raids would focus on major Japanese cities. On August 6 and 9 of 1945, the Americans would drop 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing an end to the war by September 2, 1945. The War in the Pacific. War in Europe may have been over, but Japan still continued to fight in the Pacific. The Americans had recovered from Pearl Harbor and begun to invade Japanese-held islands. Americans were now within bombing range of Japan. What made the liberation of the Pacific so challenging was the unwillingness of Japanese soldiers and the Japanese government to surrender. In Japanese culture, it was a disgrace to surrender, and soldiers were encouraged to die while fighting. Japanese fighter pilots would steer their aircraft into American ships, and infantry soldiers would blow themselves up when surrounded by American troops. The start of the atomic age. On August 6, 1945, an American bomber, the Enola Gay, dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 71,000 people would die. The Japanese refused to surrender. 3 days later, the Americans dropped another atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki. 35,000 people would die. Pressure was mounting on the Japanese leader, Hideki Tojo, to surrender. VJ Day, Victory in Japan. Emperor Hirohito would intervene and force Hideki Tojo to surrender on August 14, 1945. On September 2nd, they would officially surrender to American General Douglas MacArthur. World War II was officially over. The aftermath of World War II. World War II was over, but it had changed the world. Over 60 million people had died. The Holocaust had taken place. There were many broken lives. The United Nations was formed in the hope to resolve future conflicts. And the atomic age had begun. A new conflict with even greater potential consequences would emerge between the Americans and the Russians. This would become known as the Cold War and would take place between 1945 and 1989. Questions after the war. Would the Allies pursue revenge just as with the Treaty of Versailles? What does justice mean for those who perpetrated the war and committed atrocities? How can Europe be rehabilitated and stabilized to prevent it from falling to communism? What would the New World Order look like? Would the United Nations be different from the League of Nations? Each of these challenges would force the West to survive and redefine itself.